Hey everyone, before we get the show going, I wanted to make a quick programming note. We will not be producing any new episodes through at least Labor Day as I search for a new place to live, but I fully intend to get back to the show as soon as I'm settled. Thanks for all your support, and hope to join you all again real soon. Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 603, Break 'em Up. For Monday, August 3rd, 2020, it's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob North. Thanks for joining us. The much-anticipated tech industry testimonials before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee took place this past week, leaving some pleased to start the conversation and others completely dissatisfied. What did we learn? Tonight we'll discuss. Also understanding the threat of iOS 14, why big CPG brands are thriving right now, checking in on the Facebook boycott, plus this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the Chief Brand and Experience Officer at Gale Partners, Mr. Winston Binch. Hi, Winston.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. Now next, she's the founder and principal consultant at The Difference Engine. Ms. Farah Bostic is back. Hi, Farah.
Hi, Bob. It's very hot in this attic.
I'm sorry to put you in an attic. Now,
the
also,
place I could find.
Exactly. Now, also joining us is the host of Corona TV, author, speaker, and innovation consultant with the HMS Beagle, Mr. Joseph Jaffe. Hi, Joe.
Hey, and then it's even hotter in the dungeon over here, so be grateful, Farah.
I'm quite comfortable with all my...
That sounded so ominous.
It sounded otherwise as well. There's another way you could take it, but I'll leave that alone.
And finally, that voice you hear, we welcome back the co-host of Across the Pond, marketing transformation consultant, Mr. Samuel Mani. Hi, Sam.
Hey Bob, hey everybody. Great to be here again. Thanks for having me back.
Well, we got a lot to talk about tonight. It is just a tech-heavy week because Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google appeared before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee this past week. Farah, I've been reading a lot of articles on what happened. There's a lot of different takes on it. Opinion is mixed on whether it was useful testimony, if we got anything that we can actually find actionable or will affect the behavior of these companies going forward. But did we learn anything new? Is there anything from these testimonies that are particularly interesting to you, and why?
So I don't know that we learned anything new about the tech companies. A lot of what was revealed in the investigation that the House committee had done had already been in the public record. And so, for those of us who've been following it for a while, there wasn't a lot of breaking news coming out of it. I think the one thing that was new was Congress. For one thing, clearly having learned a lesson from the last time Mark Zuckerberg was there, and he had to explain that they made money off of ads, the committee felt like it was probably a good idea to prepare. And so clearly they had. And so I think that's well, many of them had, not everybody. There were some who were looking for tech support for like fundraising emails or something that were going into spam. But by and large, there was a sense that, and I think particularly Congresswoman Jayapal was very well prepared. But the questioning was far more technical that I think those CEOs, to the extent that they have ever testified before Congress before, have encountered. And so I think that was good. The more interesting thing to me was seeing not for the same reasons. As usual, the Republicans and the Democrats seem to be in different meetings simultaneously. The Democrats were there for antitrust, and the Republicans were there about censorship, apparently, and also about being un-American. So they had two different sort of agendas going on, but they were united in not really liking the tech companies. And so that does sort of have an interesting impact, which makes you think one way or another, the tech companies are about to get slapped around by Congress in some way. I think, if Democrats take control of certainly the White House and also the Senate, then actual regulatory reform might be on the horizon for them. And a lot of the things that they've been allowed to do because, kind of mergers and acquisition, regulatory oversight has been non-existent for about the last 10 years, might start coming back to haunt them and starting to make arguments in favor of breaking up some of these companies. On the other side of it, I think, if the Republicans hold on, it'll just be this kind of posturing fight over whether or not there are enough conservatives on YouTube and whether Donald Trump Jr. has an account on Twitter or something. But nevertheless, there's clearly some sort of reckoning coming because there seems to be bipartisan agreement that these companies are terrible. With one exception, and I think that it is the one thing that's not quite like the others, and that is kind of Apple sits there in this sort of odd zone where there is an antitrust argument to be made about the App Store, but it's not quite as strong as the other antitrust cases.
Right. I wanted to bring that up. I wanted to get your opinion about that because it seemed like everybody who writes about this tends to think in terms of tech as one big lump of evil, as opposed to taking these companies separately and dealing with their own vices uniquely. And are you seeing the result of all this being a breakup of all the companies, or certain companies are going to be targeted more than others? I mean, was there any indication from the questioning?
I think there are some that have easier fixes than others. Like I think Apple gets out of jail if it cuts the 30% fee that it charges to app makers. If it cuts it to like 15%, I think everybody backs off. It's an easy capitulation, and if that doesn't quite work, then they can do what they did where first they shipped iPhones that only had Safari on them, and then they were like, sure, if you really want to download Chrome, go ahead. I think there is a universe in which they can say it ships with the App Store, but if you want Google Play Store on your phone, knock yourself out, knowing that they still have the bulk of the revenue and, people default to habit. So I think it's easier for them to resolve these issues.
Joe,
it isn't to say that they don't matter, but it's easier to resolve them. Amazon has a much bigger problem. I think Facebook is hard to deal with because, frankly, they're kind of trying to go back in time and figure out why they bought Instagram when that deal was already approved by the government. You can't really unring that bell. You can start to say, no, you can't keep buying and burying companies, but that would require regulatory oversight. Not under this White House. Hard to say for sure it would be under any White House because it wasn't really happening under Obama either. But Amazon, I think, is the one that's the biggest, fattest target. Google is also harder because there's so many businesses represented there. But Amazon has a highly profitable business, AWS, that is subsidizing a highly anti-competitive business that is running essentially at a loss in order to be anti-competitive. And that's a much harder kind of case to make for why you should let that remain the status quo. And I also think, and people like Scott Galloway have said this for like 5 years, but it won't hurt Jeff Bezos, right? To spin off AWS as a new company will probably make him a large stakeholder in that company. He'll do just fine. But it will fundamentally change the underlying Amazon business model, which is highly problematic.
Joe, I'd love to get you to weigh in on this as well at this point, because, especially about Amazon, the Amazon question is interesting to me because the general opinion of Bezos's performance is that he was quite genial and presented well and did good service to his company during these testimonies. But at the same time, the company is exactly as Farah has described it. It's being anti-competitive. It's predatory. What happens to them, and what happens to the other companies?
Well, I thought Farah did a phenomenal job in terms of summarizing everything, and I agreed with every single thing she said except for one thing. She said, if the Democrats take over the the government and Congress. And I think what she meant to say was when. But other than that, I thought she was flawless. But
From
anyway,
your lips to God's ears, Joe.
anyway, the reason I said that is not to get political, but I may have said, told the story on the BeanCast, but last year on my way to South by Southwest, I'm sitting in the exit row on the aisle, row 11, I think. I don't even remember when last I flew, but on American Airlines, and in front of me is sitting Elizabeth Warren. And of course, I went up to her. I got a selfie with her because that's what you do with Elizabeth Warren. I then told her I was definitely voting for her, which I wasn't, but still, I can also be political. And then she proceeded to type up the speech where she spoke about splitting up the tech giants. And Elizabeth, if you are listening, because I know you do listen to the BeanCast, you might want to get one of those screen protectors, one of those privacy protectors, because I was enjoying your speech from the row behind. But, right at the end, everybody mobbed her and somebody asked her about this. And she gave the most eloquent, perfect answer, to the point where I went in opposing her because, I'm a techie and nobody wants to mess with the tech companies. And she made so much sense. And so the bottom line is that, when Elizabeth Warren is in charge of this, things are going to hit the fan big time. And going back to what you said, Bob, I think this really comes back to a central premise behind the concept of too big to fail or built to suck. It comes down to the fact that these companies are too big. And because, and I actually want to just say one more point about that, which is we've never seen companies this size in the history of companies. And the only way that they can continue to get bigger is through acquisition. And what we're seeing now is, I think, some very sketchy labor practices.
Let's delve into that for a second. The idea that no company should be this big and that they need to be broken up. I'm not saying that's not true, but there is a lot of forward thinking, especially in the works of Kim Stanley Robinson. Where he talks about the evolution of the multinational into the metanational, where companies assume a greater role in the day-to-day life of the individual than the governments do, and that the corporations begin to eclipse government in terms of providing basic services to their employees, etc. Is it inevitable that we're heading towards something like that? Or is it possible to restrict it and keep governmental power at the center of all this?
Well, when I was looking at this, I just went onto Google, I guess. I didn't use Bing. I don't know why. So I searched Google Finds, and I found that they've got $9 billion worth of antitrust for alleged abuses on shopping and Android and ads. And Apple owed me $25 for that, slowing down my phone a few years ago. And they've got a $1.25 billion fine, I think, from France for iPad price fixing. Amazon, I think there's a 2019 EU antitrust case which could cost them $23 billion, which is about 10% of their revenues. And then Facebook had that $5 billion fine in April 2020. Anyway, these are all rounding errors. And so to prove your point, Bob, even if they did get fined that $50 billion, I think they're all still fine, pardon the pun. So the only way to change the dynamic is for Elizabeth Warren and Joe Jaffe to be, reorganizing, shall we say, helping them out by perhaps splitting them up. And I was reading Scott Galloway's blog post this week, and this week the CEOs of the largest tech firms were all under consensual hallucination that an emotional opening statement absolves you of the monopoly abuse. Bezos must have thought he was being filmed for his A&E biography. Pregnant teen mum, immigrant father. We get it. You were once poor. Jesus, i.e. Elon, make them stop. And when he wrote that, I chuckled to myself, because you're dealing with egos and with characters that they're not going to change willingly. They have too much power. We want competition, and the only way for competition to happen is for them to be smaller, to have things not so owned by them. And especially when I think Bezos got tripped up by sort of admitting that he bought companies for squashing competition, and then the whole Instagram situation sort of came to light. But I was also most impressed by the Twitter chat on this topic, and it turns out that actually the person who had the best background was Sundar, and he had a nice vase or vase, and his room was well decorated. And poor Mr. Zuckerberg had got a 2 out of 10 score for his hostage room look. And Bezos needs better lighting and books on his shelves. Apparently, he didn't have any books, which is odd for a retailer. But so the Twitter chatter was much more entertaining than watching this stuff live, because you knew what they were going to say. It was interesting though that they were unprepared for the technical questions, and it's always, you never send a C-suiter out there because they actually don't do the work. So you needed someone else to prepare them better. But I see a change in government leading to more specific intervention and breaking them up. And as I was kind of being flippant about 50 billion worth of fines. Even when they get fined, it doesn't curtail the behavior. So I think it's going to have to be forced from that kind of bigger intervention. And hopefully it's going to make things better for consumers and customers. It may not be something that they're not going to do it willingly. They're going to do it kicking and screaming.
Winston, you ready to weigh in on all this? I mean, it's just like, what are the implications for the future of big tech? What's the implications to us as a result of these hearings? I mean, we all depend upon these services, or at least most of these services, on an ongoing basis. Does having them split up actually reduce their ability to deliver the kind of services we expect?
I don't think so. I mean, I've been I've long been a fan of the idea of regulation in terms of these guys. Seatbelts, CFCs, tobacco, right? It took government intervention, and the market dynamics alone won't change them, and it won't change these companies. But there is another contrary perspective, right? Which is the U.S. has no technology strategy. And I think Mark Cuban was saying this recently, right? These guys are basically it. And so we want them to be strong. We want our AI, machine learning, to be strong. And it's mostly coming from them at scale.
Isn't that true? Isn't that true everywhere outside of China, though? I mean, it's just like maybe Chinese corporations are more closely aligned with the government than other places. But it seems like the free enterprise system is what's driving most of the technology strategy from most countries. Is that not the case? Or, I mean, it kind of makes my point that maybe we're getting into the meta-national type situation.
Yeah. That's what I'm actually agreeing with you. So it's, I am for the regulation, but at the same time, the services that these guys provide are, they're just transformational.
I think this is one of the places where the scale of it is the problem itself. And, yes, we don't have a tech strategy. We don't have an industrial strategy. We don't have an education strategy. Like, we're a second world country. But in the meantime, I think that the largeness of these guys, the fact that these enormous fines that would bankrupt anybody else in the space, if there were anybody else in the space, that it doesn't, glances off of them, is kind of all the argument you need for breaking them up. And that's, in part because VCs refer to the spaces they occupy as kill zones, meaning it's not competitive anymore. There is no young upstart company that's going to come in and eat Facebook's lunch unless we break up Facebook. Same thing with Google, same thing with Amazon. So there does need to be some sort of, splitting them up, shrinking them, not necessarily Grover Norquist style, small enough to drag into a bathtub and drown it, but certainly smaller than it is now, in part because we need to be able to trust them to do these things. And I don't trust them to be running large AI projects and not violating people's privacy and human rights. Yeah, I don't trust them to do that because they can do whatever they want and still pay the fines and carry on doing whatever they wanted in the first place. And this looks like the glimmer of hope that someone might actually try to curtail them.
But I also think just building, you use the word trust, and that's the fundamental issue. The leaders of those organizations aren't filling you with the values, the behaviors, the mindsets, the philosophies and principles that do think, okay, they're in it for the greater good. They're going to make the world a better place. And even when they're on record and have a chance to say the right things, they still say the wrong things. So it's not as if they're the people who, now again, it's not a personal attack on individuals. It's more about, look, if you're getting fined for all these bad behaviors and you have cultural issues across a number of those organizations, you're not even standing on the right side of history for some of those issues. So for me, that's the problem I have. I just feel that, you could add Jack into the mix potentially. And it was funny that they were all moaning about Twitter, and Twitter wasn't there, and as sort of the culprit for a lot of the bad behavior. But I struggle with the leadership and even the oversight and the cultures of those organizations. Perhaps there could be some changes in there, but the silence of Sheryl Sandberg and the coalescence of Zuckerberg, they have an oversight board for Facebook, but so there is a mechanism there to try and reform them, but there just doesn't seem to be any intent.
They have an oversight
reform.
board that's not going to be in effect until later this year and until after the election. Is that not correct?
I was going to say, let's first of all, we may as well add Microsoft to the mix as well. Microsoft looking to take over the US operations of TikTok, having bought LinkedIn, etc. But when you look at this, whether we want to call them the big four, the big five, etc., I just want to take a slightly different view. What if they're not evil, except for Google that said, don't be evil, which was a clear indication that they were. But let's assume they're not evil. Let's just assume, they are so big and they're trying to, please their shareholders. And I'm going to give you an example just to make the case. I actually saw a commercial on TV. I never like admitting that I ever saw a commercial on TV, but whatever, for Amazon talking about, net zero carbon by 2040, 100% renewable energy by 2025. They've just purchased 100,000 electric delivery vehicles. It goes on and on and on, and how they intend to kind of become net zero carbon across their business by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. So here is a company doing a fair amount in areas that matter to the world. But then at the same time, Amazon was in the news early into the global pandemic in terms of not supplying enough, PPE or at least protection for their employees. It reminds me of a kind of a little flippant quote that says, it's tough at the top, but it's even worse at the bottom. And the fact is, these guys are on top. And so the level of scrutiny that the world, that Congress, that everyone is looking in on them is second to none. But you know what? This is their lot. They're the leaders, they're out in front. And I think if we've learned anything here is, and again, I'm going on the assumption that they in fact are not evil, although they might be a little, but just imagine the coordination that has to take place where there are some bad actors or some bad departments or some memos that got shredded or destroyed. It's pretty tough. But I just think that the bar has been set so high, and these guys are going to have to meet and exceed that bar. Otherwise, they're going to continue to be dragged in front of Congress. So I think this is the new reality. And if they can't handle the heat, as the saying goes, get out the kitchen.
But I think they've missed their moment, is the point. So the issue is, there's no new news. The GDPR fines that they're getting now is because of bad behavior that led to legislation that they're still breaching now. So the moment was 2016, 2015, 2014, and it's 2020, going to be 2021. And what has changed? What has materially changed? And that for me is the signal. So yes, they may not be evil, but we need to reform them because they're not going to reform themselves.
I think this is a really interesting conversation, in part because I hope it starts to put the lie to all of these startups saying we're going to change the world for the better, when most of the time what they want to do is raise some money so that they can ship a product to see if it works. And then if it works, they want to get rich. Like, there's no real, I just don't believe that anybody at Facebook really thought that they were like changing the world for the better. That's some nice PR and good ads later. But really, it was like, how big can this get? Mark Zuckerberg has never demonstrated himself to be like a conscientious young man who cares about society. That's not him. It's hard to argue that any of the other CEOs are really in that camp either. But even the carbon neutral program that you're talking about, Joe, sounds so much like the sort of line of reasoning that Anand Giridharadas talks a lot about with kind of the plutocracy. And this is sort of a nice feel-good thing they can do that doesn't really cost them a lot of money and actually saves them a lot of money on the back end. And it makes them look good. And by sort of bestowing us with this ecological largesse of not producing so much carbon, we should look the other way on their totally anti-competitive economic practices and what they're doing to small businesses. And I think going back to the idea of having anything like an economic strategy, you've got to, I mean, yes, of course, we should all be cutting our emissions. We should be beating the Paris Accord deadlines. It shouldn't be that freaking hard to do that. It just takes will. And that's what Jeff Bezos has shown by making that pledge. But it requires the will of peoples and governments to bring companies to a reasonable size where whole economies can be big ecosystems with lots of fish running around in them doing lots of interesting things, as opposed to, the rate of entrepreneurship has slowed to a halt in this country, and that's preceding what's going to happen when the economy takes its massive downturn in the next quarter or so. I mean, there is a need now to start thinking, being more thoughtful about what we allow companies to do and what we expect of them. It shouldn't just be like, hey, we're gonna do this good thing, now look the other way on everything we do. No, you should pay your taxes in all the countries that you operate in. Step one. Step two, you should not engage in practices that we would consider to be anti-competitive or antitrust. Like all of those things, or falling under antitrust laws, all of those things should just be freaking table stakes. But because we've been sort of, oh, wow, tech, it's so complicated, especially the we I'm talking about now is Congress, like they've been intimidated. They don't understand how these businesses work. They're so big, they're so innovative. Gosh, what about China? Like all of those things make it so they don't really know where to begin. And I think this week we started to see a glimmer of some people figuring out where to begin. And one of those places is starting to break up at least a couple of them.
Well, this is.
Well, I was just going to add, though, some of them haven't been intimidated. Most of them have received donations to their campaigns and organizations from all of those organizations that were being grilled. I think, was it Representative Jordan who received 10,000 from, I can't remember if it was Facebook or whoever he was shouting at. So if you follow the lobbyists and that route, you'll realize that there is there's some challenges we have with the way things are run, and if everyone came clean, then everyone would have to give that money back. So it's a bit murkier, which we all know, but $10,000 shouldn't allow you to turn a blind eye to billions and billions of dollars of anti-competitive behavior.
Well, it certainly will be interesting to see what results from all this. Obviously, there's some very divergent opinions about how to make it happen, but I think something's going to happen soon. Well, let's move on and let's talk next about the ad tech world raising warning flags over the impact of iOS 14, which is due out this fall. Apple announced the new operating system, the latest version of their popular iPhone operating system, and apparently it's going to give all kinds of headaches to anybody trying to serve ads via the platform. Facebook went as far as to say it could seriously impact their ability to deliver ads via mobile at all. Winston, what's behind the uproar, and do we need to worry or just stop whining and get creative already about how we deliver advertising? I mean, what's the answer here?
I'm going to say stop complaining. Get used to it. It's the way the world's going. So I'm in the stop whining camp. We've been talking about purpose-driven and customer first for years, and I think we all know it's mostly been lip service. But we're moving into this space now, right? Not being customer-centric is a real business liability. And for me, these types of guardrails, like ad blocking's existed for a long time. These guardrails are welcome. Anything that puts customers, their needs and wants first, I'm behind. I support it. And I think companies and brands need to understand you can't just buy your way to growth anymore. You need a great story. You need a great experience. Increasingly, you need meaningful values. You have to earn it. and move people both emotionally and rationally. So, I think, Facebook's complaining, but we were just talking about them. Facebook does what Facebook wants. They'll find a way around it. And the companies that I get excited about right now, Chipotle, Peloton, Warby Parker, Sephora, right? They get this move towards customer centricity, making their customers feel known and valued, and they're creating great experiences in the middle of the marketing funnel and on their own channels. So, as a brand storyteller and experience designer, I love that this forces more innovation, and potentially moves us to create better experiences. I don't think Apple's killing advertising. They're just giving customers more control.
Let's talk specifically about what iOS 14 is going to do, because I think, just in case people out there don't know, I mean, first of all, it's going to make every single ad interaction an opt-in situation where they're basically agreeing to have ads shown to them. And it's going to be an ongoing thing. You can shut it all down on the device, or you can make a decision every single time you go into a new app. I mean, is that going to seriously impact advertisers who are being creative, like Winston says, Joe? I mean, it's just like, if you're being innovative, you should be able to get around something like this, at least be able to deliver some kind of meaningful interaction with your customers that are not dependent upon tracking. Joe?
You know what? I was trying to be so diligent by keeping myself on mute when I wasn't talking.
For a second, I thought the entire system went down.
No, I thought Joe had nothing to say, and I was going to get very worried then.
Yeah, me too. I was also worried. I was worried that nobody was listening to me. I think maybe one point of comparison is certainly Europe leading the way with respect to every single website that you ended up visiting, and still to this day you have to accept cookies, and it happens again and again and again. Number two, I think that there are still value exchanges, sometimes explicit, where in order to get certain content or certain experiences, you don't really have a choice as a consumer but to opt in. And I think the third, which I think there are going to be other ways that go beyond a more I'm not saying this is an oversimplified discussion, right, which is just thinking about advertising. I think also I was looking at in prepping for this, some of the previews for iOS 14, and one of the things is picture-in-picture, that you can actually watch a video, and while you're on email and multitasking, which is fantastic for younger consumers, for millennials and Zoomers, not so good for us old folk. In terms of the multitasking part, but suddenly you're watching a video and the size of the video is tiny, and that's fine for a consumer, especially when you're multitasking. It's not so good for advertisers as well, that are actually, I'm imagining, serving an ad or having an ad being seen, and it's tiny. So I think there are going to be different ways that are going to challenge advertisers and their agencies to be better, and as we all know, that's not something that comes naturally to this community.
Is the problem, as usual, is the problem dynamic ad insertion in this situation? Because it's kind of funny to think of traditional advertising that ran on broadcast television being native, but in some ways, when you're streaming content, if you put in an ad break and it's part of the stream and not being dynamically inserted, it's almost like native content. There's no way to get rid of it. So does that give an opportunity for that type of advertising to maybe rise back up and be an effective way to reach consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But the more interesting, and I was trying to make this point, the more interesting piece to me is that, with the rise of social, many brands gave up the investment on their own website, creating better experiences there and their email journeys, right? And I actually think that, again, this puts pressure on, maybe it's a return to really kind of building those experiences. And I think, D2C brands get this, every interaction is a brand interaction. But a lot of legacy players, had put everything into, targeted ads and as opposed to really crafting a meaningful experience.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It hopefully will force bar raising in marketing, advertising, creative, and content, and stop the kind of lame, low, race to the bottom and just spamming people. And the opt-in thing is really interesting because being British, I get a lot of my news information from UK and overseas sites, and it's a horrible experience. It's actually gotten better in the last 6 months or so. So the sites are now a bit more cooperative. When you opt in or out, it tends to work now, and there are sort of hybrid options that allow you to kind of customize and let you in faster and easier. So I think the technology or the performance of that has gotten better, and I've gotten used to it. But if it's going to be this approach of having to consider each and every interaction, I think it's going to have a huge negative impact on the ad, obviously the ad tech, the ad market, because people don't want advertising. I mean, as much as I love marketing and advertising work in the industry, we all know the data that says what percentage of people avoid it or don't want it. So you're going to have to find ways to engage with people and to engage and be permission based. And I know, obviously Joe's written a few books in sort of Death is Zero and Death of the 30-second ad and all those types of things. So we've known this for years, and the technology let you get away with being crap, and now you're going to have to raise the bar again. But I'm always intrigued though when Facebook are complaining about something. So when a $723 billion company is complaining about something an $1,800 billion company is doing, I kind of have empathy not. So it's for me, it's kind of interesting that they're moaning about this change, because it seems to be being done for the benefit of the consumer. So again, I feel as if they're making the wrong argument. But when it comes down, I was going to say, when it comes down to it, I was reading the challenge, I think, when in reality is that I was reading a story which was publicized a couple of weeks ago about a New York entrepreneur, Brian Taylor. He had his Harlem Doggy Day Spa grooming business. COVID's kind of destroyed it. He's taken it on the road with a van, and he's using Facebook, Instagram, and Nextdoor to drive hyper-local relevant messaging to people to come and patronize his spa. So for the smaller type of business, what's the impact there? So we may have biased or thought about the big, large brands, but what about the smaller, local entrepreneurial businesses who Facebook and Instagram, these are their platforms. This is how they make money. This is how they thrive. This is how they make a living. And while I'm not, again, trying to argue in favor of the Facebooks of this world per se, I'm nervous that the disruption may have a disproportionate negative impact to smaller.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point, Sam. I mean, there's kind of a balancing act here. This is obviously good for consumers, but there's also a need to be somewhat more business friendly right now, especially given the pandemic.
But it is, it is. I mean, when my last job, as I often call it, was as an interactive strategist and then running interactive media for Shy Day. And then when I went out on my own several years later, I wrote Life After the 30-Second Spot. And I remember I would position it on the road. This is really early. I mean, this is 2003, 2004. And I would talk about digital as 4D. And I would say, if you think about it, the richest form of communication, bar none, is in fact video, right? Sight, sound, and motion. It's using 3 different senses together. I said, but digital is sight, sound, motion, and interactivity, where actually a consumer is part of the actual experience and part of the process, and their ability to use their mouse and now using touch takes it to a whole new level. So why am I saying this? Because again, just going back to this idea of picture-in-picture, this could be an absolute renaissance for advertising. How? Because you can actually click on an ad in a video and now pull up a map or start writing an email or open up Safari and fill out a form while you're still watching the video. So to actually, I mean, everything that is bad about advertising, right, comes down to 2 things. One is it's intrusive, and 2 is generally it's irrelevant and poor targeting. But now, without taking you out of the experience and being able to actually, if you're interested, say, yeah, I'll have one of those. Here's my email address. This could be very powerful, and it could be equally powerful, if not more powerful, for small businesses. Where is my nearest dealer? Where is my nearest store? Kind of send me directions. So if I'm understanding this correctly, I think this could be absolutely phenomenal. And why is Facebook upset about it? Because Facebook never wants you to be taken out of their little garden with their beautiful walls. So too bad.
I think I quite agree with you, Joe. I think that it's also pretty ironic coming from Facebook to be complaining about changing the rules on advertising when, small businesses complain mightily all the time that Facebook changes things whenever it wants to. And they suddenly, and Amazon too, they change their rules constantly, and then they just sort of have to adapt, or they just die. I think, though, the bigger point that you're making, Joe, is the one that I really agree with strongly, which is it reminds me of a conversation I was in at an event a few years ago where there were people from the Google Chrome team and there were people from Google Ad Sales. And these are tribes that don't really get along very well, in large part because the team working on Chrome is trying to make the experience of being on the internet better. And the ad sales team, as far as the Chrome team is concerned, is breaking the internet all the time by serving terrible sort of advertising experiences. And the need to serve the advertising breaks the actual thing that the user is trying to do. And, iOS 14 is taking an interesting tack here, which is really kind of moving towards, I'm not going to say it actually is achieving, but moving towards a real transparency about what the apps on your phone want from you when you're using them and when you're not. I mean, apparently one of the interesting things that's already been uncovered by iOS 14 is TikTok taking the text you've copied in some other app, and it grabs that. So that's awesome, because the thing that you were texting to your friend is definitely the thing that you want on TikTok. But the idea here of trying to improve the device experience, improve the app experience, let people do what they really want to do, I agree. I think it could really unleash a lot of creativity and, in general, just a better experience. And I think, going back to, I think you said this, Sam, of everyone for years going to such lengths to try to avoid advertising, like, this is why. The advertising is interruptive. It breaks the experience. Figure out a way to be embedded, figure out a way to be organic, figure out a way to not be annoying, figure out a way to add value, and then I'll let you in. Otherwise, I'm going to go to whatever lengths I can go to in order to shut you out. And it's interesting that Apple continues to sort of double down on that.
Well, I'm not going to download this till 14.4.63 anyway. So hopefully that's 12 months from whenever they launch it, and it will work, and it won't break my phone. And also the battery reserve thing that they promised actually does work, and my phone, I can use my phone for 5 hours after the batteries run out. So sorry to be self-centered there, but that's what I think people are probably going to be more concerned about than this advertising debate.
Well, there's another thing that keeps coming up, and we've talked about it a lot tonight, which is that kind of pressure between the big companies versus the small companies, the DTC brands versus the big CPG brands. And apparently, during this time of crisis, a report this week indicates that consumers are clinging to big legacy CPG brands now more than ever. Sam, do you believe this is true? And if so, what's driving this behavior? What do you think's going on here in the marketplace?
There is truth behind it. A lot of those legacy companies have actually reported great results over the last few quarters. Full disclosure, I was formerly at Campbell's Soup, and that's one of the businesses which has reported that there's been a lot of soup sales, been pantry stocks or pantry loading in the last few months when it's typically been off season for their products. And looking at this survey, you have to kind of double click into it. I think the overall top 5 brands that shoppers love from the survey said it was the US Postal Service, which is ironic, hilarious, and also in the US right now actually quite a hot topic. Google was number 2. UPS was number 3, Amazon was number 4, and Netflix was number 5. And so there is a theme behind why those things are loved, because we've been ordering lots of stuff and getting lots of stuff. And so the CPG wins in this space. It was interesting that the top drivers said brands or solutions which are reliable, had a good reputation, had the products I need available when I need them. And so it feels like it was, hey, can I find you on your shelf? Can I buy you? Are you there when I need you? And that plays into a lot of the scale, the mass production of these larger brands. So I think the timing of the research, the timing of the data tended to play to them. But there was some different demographics, which was interesting to me. So the baby boomers, number one was US Postal Service, brands like Reynolds Wrap, AAA, Campbell Soup, Betty Crocker and Levi's. And then Gen Z's was again USPS, Breyers Ice Cream, Reynolds Wrap, Levi's, Betty. So there was themes for the Gen Z's, Gen X's, and the Boomers, and then Millennials was more Netflix, Disney Plus, Nintendo, Pixar, Nike, Ben & Jerry's, Apple, and Gen Z's was YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Nintendo, Disney Plus, Nike. So it was almost as if the people who had the money and basically were running, or had the big households, were more of the legacy traditional brands, and then the younger people were more entertainment, lifestyle, and that was kind of driving the response to this. So you got to think about some of the bias in the survey. But I think your question said, hey, what's going on with the behaviors? And I was doing some research and I saw some McKinsey work. And I thought that was quite nice how they framed it in terms of there's sort of four themes. The return to the old normal. So what's going to stick around? And things like after COVID, we're going to go back to normal. Food delivery, are we really? That's probably going to return back to the same level. And I feel that some of these brands which are winning now, they were there, they were available. There wasn't any real love or affinity, so they're probably going to return back to the same level. There's some exciting things happening in the world right now. So maybe some of the brands pop through, and you think things like Zoom, which has tripled in value, that's probably going to have some higher level when we come back in a year's time. But I think it's more about which are the new experiences, what's going to change, which brands are actually tapping into this more health and well-being space. So again, maybe deviating from CPG, but the head spaces and the mind space and mindfulness, all of that touchy-feely stuff is actually very human, very relevant. And so I think brands that play into that will win over the mid and long term. And so I feel that, yes, the CPGs might be winning in the short term, but in the last 4-6 months, they really haven't changed their way of marketing, their way of being, their way of doing. And so I still see that the consumers, which will go back to a more sort of, I think, a more purposeful, more, a more meaningful way of consumption in the future, will be looking for brands that play into that, and not the traditional legacy nostalgic brands, perhaps, who didn't do anything different than remind you of the past. And this new normal, different times, uncertain times, I think we're going to come back in a different way. So my view is that it's a temporary bump for most. Maybe one or two will get a longer term bump, but I feel it's a temporary bump, and we're going to really pivot coming out of this. Well, coming out of it, it's probably going to be another 12, 18 months before we come out of it.
Does the rest of the panel agree here that the CPG brands did not do anything substantively different than they were doing before, and that this is just a consumer-led phenomenon, and it's not a result of anything that the brands were doing to market effectively during this time frame? Winston, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, maybe it's apparent, but CPG comes with a lot of resource, and in terms of spendability, right? And we did a survey, I think last April, that showed that there was like a 40% lift in affinity for brands who communicated well through digital platforms. And it would make sense, particularly with these brands at scale, that they're present. I mean, I don't know if that totally is the reason for their success right now, but they've been out there.
I think there are, the kind of obvious reasons why some of these things have done well. We talked months ago about the alleged toilet paper hoarding that was also a product of people were home. They weren't pooping elsewhere. So they needed more toilet paper at home. But you need more food at home. You need more shampoo at home. You need more everything at home when you're not traveling or going to the gym or going to an office or school. So those things feel like long-term, short-term. I think you're right. It is another 12, 18 months before we're on the other side of those needs. But it also made me think, this survey made me think of some work we did back when I was at Holland Partners. We did it right at the beginning of 2008, end of 2007, and it was perfect timing because we were curious about what consumer behavior in a time of recession would look like. And then we got one. And there were some really interesting things there. Now, the shape of that recession, I think, is going to be different. Is going to turn out to be different than the shape of the likely coming recession. But nevertheless, there were really interesting things there about people still wanted to buy brands. They just were more price conscious. So they were looking for deals. They were joining Groupon. They were, getting rain checks. They were on like community sites telling each other where to use a coupon for Pampers. There were behaviors in there to try to stay with the brands they loved, but spend a little less on them and be more frugal. But there were also decisions made to stick with certain kinds of luxury brands, that the quality of it was worth it. You weren't going to go through it really quickly. So it made sense to continue to buy your favorite scotch if you could afford scotch, because, you're not going to drink it all in one go, hopefully. And it was still sort of an experience and something that you could enjoy over time. There was a lot of conversation then about experiencing or prizing experiences like education and travel. And I think obviously travel is tricky right now. But education, and I think this is kind of related to where you were going, Sam, with the idea of sort of wellness and mindfulness products as well. This sort of, how can I use this time where I could be doom scrolling and worrying to do something to take care of myself or feel better or improve myself in some way. I think there's a lot of interest in those things. But I don't know that I think that these companies have to do anything different. They just have to be themselves. Your favorite brand of toilet paper is still your favorite brand of toilet paper. Your favorite shampoo is still your favorite shampoo. As long as they're available, then you're going to default to those, especially if you can get a good deal. I know that, the other interesting thing over this experience has been the experience of scarcity, which I think has been new for certainly a lot of Americans, of walking into a supermarket and seeing empty shelves. And so there is a kind of, if you can get your preferred paper towel brand, you are going to get it, whatever way it takes. Because when you walk into where I am, the IGA is always out of paper towels. It's only the stuff that is practically worthless that they still have on the shelves, and they've got tons of it because no one wants it. Doesn't matter how cheap it is.
It is true. It's I think that you can tell the weak brands by what's on the shelf when you go when the zombies have been and cleared all the shelves. It's like, oh wow. No one likes your scouring pad, or oh no, those toilet cleaners aren't obviously the thing.
It was
no
a
one has
good
the
time.
handle
It
for
was a
So
good time to eat
great-
vegan food. It was a very good time to eat vegan food.
Yeah.
It was.
I mean,
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, there was also just a basic human insight at play here that people, find comfort in the familiar. So these brands, many of them they've been out there for a long time. They're iconic. They're easy to recognize, and they make you feel better. Take a little bit load off the old brain there in times of deep stress.
Yeah, and we, there's data that for me, I just love behavioral data. And there was a report the other day from the New York Times saying that tailors have never been so busy because everyone got fat over COVID. So it doesn't matter what people said they did. People are actually just eating more, and so they're taking out their clothes. And so food is obviously comfort, and it plays into psychology. So I think partially some of this is just human nature, and perhaps in 18 months time, more the healthier brands and sort of salads of this world will probably come to the fore, where we will actually try and work off the COVID weight that everyone's put on.
I've lost 8 pounds during COVID, and I didn't really need to lose that weight. I mean, come on.
I didn't mean to lose. I just sort of forgot to have lunch.
Yeah.
I've lost almost 20 pounds.
You know what? I used to like you at the start of this show. I don't know how I feel about this. Well, I've gained it for all you.
Well,
I've gained the 28 pounds
real
for all of you. How about
real
that?
quick.
Why? Because I haven't purchased any of these loved brands. That's why.
Hey, real quick, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I want to quickly touch on the fact that Facebook this week announced their earnings or their growth numbers, and their growth did slow under the boycott, but they still posted a gain of 7%. I think it was 17%, was it? Something like that. Apparently they're still doing quite fine. And it made me wonder, Joe, I mean, as a result of all this boycott that was going on, did it have any impact on the company at all? Is there going to be any kind of change there? And this is not to evaluate the reasons behind the boycott itself. It's more about evaluating whether Facebook heard the message.
I want to carry on talking about my fat blogging, but okay. So, Yeah, I mean, there's been change. Companies like North Face that were one of the first to leave are slowly coming back. But then again, they said they were taking a break for a month. I think larger companies that have a lot more scrutiny and a lot more governance issues like Coke have said they're staying away. I mean, they've come back, I think, to YouTube and I think by definition Google, but they're staying away from Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So some of the larger ones are staying away, but there are pronounced changes, and one of them is that the platform Facebook is undergoing a brand safety audit from the Media Rating Council. And they have acknowledged that the boycott could affect earnings next quarter. So there certainly should be a little bit of a lag. So it's definitely left its mark. And I think, I think the old saying, right, where there's smoke, there's fire. So this is the first time I think Facebook has had to do a little bit of if not an about face, at least a step back. It's the first time that we've seen that they're not, in fact, completely invulnerable, that there is a kryptonite type nemesis or counterbalance out there. So I would say, people are going to come back and they'll come back through self-interest and seasonality. And remember, a boatload of revenue at these companies come from smaller players, small business, not even small and medium-sized, small business. So I think it's, we can look at the big brands, the North Faces and the Cokes, but really most of the action happens at the rock face. And I think we have seen the beginnings of the seeds of change.
And Sam, any last thoughts? I know this is near and dear to your heart. It's just like, are you satisfied that Facebook is making some needed changes and is worthy of advertising on again, or is it still all bets are off, stay away for a while?
Well, when I was last on the show, we talked about this. I believe Facebook stock price was $245, and on Friday it's closed at $253. And so the boycott, it's worth more after the boycott, which says it all as far as I'm concerned. Nothing will change the valuation of them or their ability to make money. And so, I mean, those are just facts. So I'd like to think positively and optimistically, and obviously I believe that we can do better and they can do better. And there has been some reports from people there. Some people have kind of come out and said, look, we are going to do differently. We are going to be, I think Carolyn Everson posted something recently. So there are some good souls there trying to make a difference, and we'll have to see what happens.
Well, with that, it's time for our fair, fail, foul. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Winston Binch. You can find him at galepartners.com. That's the home of the company where he is the chief brand and experience officer. Am I right about that?
That's right.
Okay, so tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote?
We're doing a lot of brand work these days. That's in my title. But I think that, we talked a little bit about today, but, the shift, and I think it's an exciting one, is that activism is growing. It's becoming a bigger part in culture, and brands are starting to wake up to that fact. And so we're really starting to bake that into our brand strategy efforts. So doing a lot of CRM and loyalty work as well, journey-based storytelling, but I'm really most excited about the social justice and brand strategy stuff we've got on the table.
That sounds really exciting. Definitely a very, very exciting company from what I've been able to find out about it. That's really cool. Now, next up, Farah Bostic. You can find her at thedifferenceengine.co. That's a consultancy where she does analysis and research and brand consulting and all kinds of stuff for every brand that she works with. Tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote?
Yeah, for once I actually have something. So last year we undertook a bit of a look again at what the purpose of the difference engine really is, and articulated it as we help business leaders make big decisions. Because in the end, that's the only reason people don't want research; they want an answer. And so looking at it through that lens, we've decided to put into field. I'm hoping it's the end of next week, but I think it's going to be the week after, a survey of consumers. It'll be a national survey. And then we're also going to do digital diaries with people. So kind of ethnography, but made by people themselves, since we can't be with them in person. Really diving into how people are making decisions now. It feels like we've been in this crisis for long enough for people to have started to establish some new habits, to start to reflect on the difference between how they're doing things now and how they were doing them before. And so we want to understand a bit more about how people make decisions through kind of three big lenses. One is sort of, what matters to them. Could be their values, could be something else. What the kind of methods for making decisions are for people, depending on whether they're short-term, long-term, big decisions, small decisions. And then finally, we're really curious about what kinds of systems of accountability people have, if they have them at all, and what they're starting to think about there. We want to do it first as a consumer wave, and then we will follow up with some interviews with people in business as well, and academics who are experts on the subject of decision making. But we're going to post something on the site this week. If you have any ideas, listeners, for things you'd like to know about how people are making decisions now, or people we should interview as experts, please feel free to get in touch.
Yeah.
And once we're done with it, we're going to release it, hopefully by Labor Day or just after.
If I can just weigh in here and say I advocate for any chance to get in touch with Farah. She is a delightful human being with lots of very, very smart ideas. So you definitely want to talk to her. Next up, we have Joe Jaffe. Joseph Jaffe can be found at lots of different addresses around the internet, but the central point is probably jaffejuice.com. That's where you can find more about his books. You can get in touch with him. You can get him to speak at your event. You can get him to consult with you. You can find out more about Corona TV. Tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote, Joe?
Well, just two things I would say. One is we just saw a few minutes before the show started that Lord & Taylor filed for bankruptcy. And I keep coming back to the premise behind Built to Suck, that it's not even just promoting a book. It's really promoting an idea that we really are seeing now, this acceleration of this, central hypothesis in the book, that the age of the corporation is coming to an end. And, I'm very proud of the writing. There are solutions. There is, not every company will fail, but many will. And I think it's because of content creators and startups and technology. And so I'm proud of that. And also, to what Bob was saying, I've now done just over 82 interviews on Corona TV. And every single day, every weekday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm doing the show live, and then there's a Zoom after show where you can actually not just interact with me, but with my guest. Tomorrow, although most people will probably be hearing this afterwards, Mark Schulman, who is the drummer for Pink and Cher, and believe it or not, this is a rock star who lectures and speaks and writes about stage fright. So it's been just amazing to learn so much about so many people during the age of COVID and just about life. And I really, invite you guys to come and listen, because it's been life-changing for me.
It really is an interesting show, Joe. So thank you for putting it on, and definitely out there, if you haven't seen it, check it out. And last but not least, we have Samuel Mani. You can find him at marketingtransformed.com. That's the home of the podcast Across the Pond, and as well how you get in touch with him about consulting. So tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote, Sam?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So Across the Pond Marketing Transformed, you can find us at marketingtransformed.com. That's the podcast I do with my buddy Chris Lawson. He's based in the UK and I'm based in the US, and you get not one but two British accents in a 30-minute podcast. And we've been focused on season 4 on the Agile Marketing Action Plan, and we've talked about how to build a brand and how to turn insights into action. There's an episode just gone live on how to do performance marketing. We've got one coming up on how to build your creative and content, and then how to improve your customer experience, and how to build a growth mindset's coming in the future. So we keep those chugging out every Wednesday, whether it's Christmas, New Year, or this year in November the 4th, we'll have an episode. So every Wednesday going through the year, including November the 4th. And I call that out because mark your calendar, because that's the day after the election. So even on that day, we're not going to be, you're going to be competing with the big news of the election and also with a latest episode of the Across the Pond Marketing Transform podcast. So there you go. And another shout out, I am doing a webinar for the Content Marketing Institute with a lady called Deanna Ransom from Televerdi, and it's all about agile marketing and the role of content in the age of disruption. So if you want to hear about agile marketing and the role of content and disruption, check that out on the 13th of August. You'll find it online if you search for it, find it on LinkedIn somewhere. And I'm looking forward to speaking there and taking advantage of that.
Sounds great. Sounds awesome. And definitely, I've had Sam on panels before. He is wonderful to hear speak live, so you definitely want to get involved with that. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. And of course, you can find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. First up, Nike pulls off an editing marvel. Winston, this ad was amazing. It almost was good enough to distract us from the accusations of racial bias in the company's ranks, which is a whole other side story, which gives them some possible foul credits. But this ad was pretty amazing. It garnered a lot of support. I was actually surprised at the level of adulation this ad got. I mean, it was really great editing, but it wasn't necessarily a stupendous ad, but apparently a lot of people felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, Bob, you said it. It was a bit of a masterwork in editing, but, great ad, but I watched it once. I'm still mostly interested in what they're doing organizationally, right? I mean, there's a problem you just can't throw ads at. And Nike has done, they've made a substantial investment with Michael Jordan, but, I think people are just, they're going to grow leery of just of talk. They want to see the action.
Well, next up we have the fail of the week. The fail goes to Tyson Foods, who's officially now under investigation by the FTC, FARA, for false advertising campaigns, false advertising claims, rather. Specifically around support of family farms, which clearly they are not, and safety for workers where people are in plants where people are dying, not just from COVID, but from other types of industrial accidents on a regular basis. This is pretty bad when you think about it in terms of the advertising. I mean, they just got to get their act together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the rate of COVID infection in meatpacking facilities is really causing this additional scrutiny to Tyson. They've managed to go for a really long time claiming to be supportive of family farms when no, and there have been a million and one documentary exposés about how they raise chickens and all of that. So maybe it's their turn in the barrel, as they say.
Maybe it is. And then the foul of the week, Joe, goes to the LA Times, who are accused of doing an ad for editorial deal with the Pac-12. Now, if you don't know who the Pac-12 is, it's a organization of universities, their sports teams. It's one of the sports leagues in the NCAA. But
Go Ducks.
But apparently the Pac-12 president made a deal with the LA Times president, I guess, the head of the publisher or whatever, trying to get a deal where they would run more advertising in exchange for good coverage on the site, on LA Times site. Now, obviously, this deal never actually went through. The editorial staff raised a huge row over it, went crazy over it. LA Times is disavowing any knowledge of it, or at least saying that they had no real intention to go through with this. But it's still kind of ugly when there's a contract out there circulating saying that you're going to do something like this, even if the editorial staff just kind of put the kibosh to it.
I mean, listen, two things. One is during these times of COVID, everybody's got to make a living. And my second point is, who is the LA Times? I've heard of the Pac-12, but what is the LA Times?
How rude.
Sorry.
How rude.
Too snarky and cynical at 9:07 p.m.
Well, listen, I'll pile on by saying, as the look at this more closely, this whole issue of the athletes going back, especially in the college sports, and the fact that everything relies on football and the players are not getting any of the reassurance. And so from the Pac-12, the players are threatening to boycott if they don't get improvements in safety and in justice. And it just makes me think that they're not even being paid. And so the follow the money is a phrase that, has been used multiple times, but it's frightening how much money is involved in this. And, that payola accusation that was made, and the fact that the people who are putting their lives on the line, mostly the athletes, don't even benefit from any of the shenanigans going on elsewhere.
Well, have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online. Use the hashtag #FairFailFoul. That's #FairFailFoul. And that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C-Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. As I said at the beginning of the show, we'll be back again in a month or so. So hope you'll join us then.
Like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.